Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Not All Manufacturing Automation is Created Equal, Implementing Outcome-Based Strategies to Drive Real Results. I'm Heather Masaccio, your host from Pharmaceutical Online and Life Science Connect. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have a question for our speakers or wish to share any thoughts of your own, please submit it through the Q&A box on your screen. Our speakers will be happy to address your questions at the conclusion of the presentation during our Q&A session. Now, if you encounter any problems with the stream today, please try refreshing your browser first. If your problem persists, go ahead and use that Q&A tool to submit a question, and I'll help get you back on track. This event will be available on demand, normally within about 24 hours. You can just use that same link that you used today. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Brian Curran is the Senior Vice President of Manufacturing Excellence Success at MasterControl. And Dan Gregor is a Principal Technical Solutions Manager, also at MasterControl. Welcome to both gentlemen, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to throw it to Brian to get us started.
Thank you so much. Very excited to be here today with Dan and share some observations. If you are familiar with MasterControl, the logo that you see there, or MasterControl, the name, you probably are familiar with us as a quality management system, and you're wondering, why is MasterControl talking to me about manufacturing? Well, as it turns out, we developed a manufacturing solution about 8 years ago. And so our primary focus, both Dan and mine, and a big group of our part of our company, is focusing on helping reduce the errors associated with manufacturing. And in doing that, what we've learned and what we want to share today is how to focus on and deliver outcome-based manufacturing strategies. And fortunately, I also include the third part of our slides will show real customer results, real graphs coming from our customers that you can use as a measure of looking at what you can do in your own organization. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Dan and myself, and I'll have Dan do an intro once he actually starts his, a little bit more about himself. I've been with MasterControl for over 20 years and focusing on manufacturing excellence success, helping our customers be successful and helping our company be successful in serving those customers. So today's agenda, 4 main things. Want to highlight the shared goals and the patterns that we see across the industry. And then we're going to introduce something that we call, or coined, the strategic return on automation. Highlight some things that we've seen where customers have maybe gone from paper to computer and carried too many paper relics or artifacts, so shifting to a digital mindset, and then share those real world results that I mentioned earlier. So aligning on what matters, what are the shared goals that we see across life science manufacturing and pharma manufacturers? First and foremost, these are the 4 errors. First and foremost, the one we see most commonly is reducing release times. Because of the paper-based process, the delays and the friction introduced as a result of that end up causing long release times. And depending on your particular part of the pharma industry, that could be days or weeks or even months. Second most common thing we hear is we need to decrease errors. We just have too many errors that are occurring, and we agree. Third thing is improving resource optimization. The paper-based process leads to way too many people being thrown at the system to try to make it work. And then the fourth thing, which resonates probably the strongest with executives, is how do we increase our overall production throughput? With the same number of people that we have, can we actually deliver more product to more people sooner? So what we see in manufacturing today, and depending on your environment, you may have more boxes than this. This is a simplified model that says most companies do a manufacturing process, and then a packaging process, and then a review and release, and then there's also this disposition box that I'll explain on the next slide. The focus here we're tackling the first problem that we hear the most often. How do we reduce release time? So what we see is the overall lead time is too many days. And this is where we garnered the attention of the executives, because the review and release time is, we'll use 14 days as an average. Sometimes this is as small as days, and sometimes this is as much as 40 days, 50 days. Our highest was over 100 days. But this review and release process is too long. And so what happens, I'm just going to walk through the process. When you're using a paper-based batch record, everybody knows how many pages there are. Very few customers know actually how many manual entries there are. The average number of manual entries in the customers that we've analyzed is 1,100 manual entries per batch record. For easy math, I've just used 1,000, and I've put it into two main unit procedures. One would be 500 manual entries in the manufacturing phase, and the second one would be packaging, 500 manual entries. And like I said, this could be anything. This could be upstream, downstream, whatever your processes are. For simplicity's sake, we have 1,000 manual entries that are occurring during your manufacturing or production process. The problem is that once we get to the review and release, they also have to review 1,000 manual entries, every line, every page. And the net result of that is, even though you're checking for errors and identifying errors and fixing errors, it still leaves a mess. It's a really common complaint that the paper-based batch record with all the scribblies, et cetera, it's a mess. And the business wants to deliver the finished goods, because the finished goods are ready to ship once they're done through the packaging. But then we've got to go through the documentation and the review and release process. And so there's a whole lot of people at the company saying, let's ship it. Should we ship at risk? And the QA group rightly says, no way, there's too much risk. The right first time is very low. And interestingly, most of the errors, and sometimes as much as 100%, but I'll say 99% of the errors found in this at this point are GDP errors. The other dynamic that we see very commonly across pharma manufacturers is this is the QA group that's performing this review and release. Well, the manufacturing and production groups don't want to deliver to the QA group a really poor, error-ridden batch record. So what they do is they do their own disposition. They do their own pre-review and release, where they have to review all 1,000 entries, line by line, page by page. And this takes, let's say, for example, on average, 7 days. So your overall time, once you're actually done with the product, is 21 days to ship the product that had been produced 21 days ago. And that's a very common problem. And implement or substitute whether yours is 14 days or 14 hours, or in the cell and gene space, you may be in a small number of hours, or in the biologic space, you might be in the weeks. Whatever that is, it's a very common occurrence that the release time is just taking too much time. Why do we want to reduce lead time? I often ask customers this, like, do you need help understanding why there's so much value? And the common response is, no, everybody knows this. That's why we're being asked to reduce the lead time. But to me, it's a good reminder, and I'll show some of the data later. Well, first and foremost, we want to increase the throughput. Can you deliver more batches with the same resources and maybe at the same site without purchasing an additional site, without purchasing additional equipment? Then there's all the additional metrics beyond just the throughput, improving your working capital, how much of the capital is tied up in inventory and just quarantine waiting to be shipped. Your inventory management, decreasing the holding cost of that, reducing your back orders and stock outs, improving the trust and patient well-being. Back orders and stock outs may be a reality, but with life science and particularly pharma manufacturers, this is something we have to avoid at all costs. These are the things that your executives want to know, and these are the things that if we can improve, will justify or build the case of, well, how can we get off of paper and all the problems that we have with paper, and how can we go digital? So Dan and I have helped more than 200 customers who have completed more than 1.5 million batch records with over 500 million data captures. So that's a large body of work. And in that body of work, we see things that maybe others don't see because everybody else is tackling the problem just for their own batch records. So some of the patterns we've seen, we've pulled together into this concept called return on automation. And that'll be this section of the presentation. There's an automation gap that we see. The picture on the left-hand side, when you talk to any pharma manufacturer and ask them if they are automated, they say absolutely. Well, I mean, we're almost fully automated. And what they're really answering is, I have a bunch of robotics, or I have conveyor belts, or I have specialized equipment and bioreactors, etc. On the left-hand side, we probably see a robotics with printed circuit boards. Notice there's no people. There's such a high volume of circuit boards or other items like it that you automate the people out of it. Well, that's not the case for the vast majority of life science products. The case there is we have people involved, often in PPE, like this picture shows, but there's an automation gap with life science manufacturers in that they think they're automated, and there is a high degree of automation, yet the document they're using to instruct the operators what to do, and the document they're using to capture what actually happens, is a paper-based batch record. And that's the gap that we see needs to be filled because it introduces so many errors and causes downstream problems like long release times. So we would like to redefine automation for life sciences. It's not just about the robotics. It's not just about the distributed control systems. It's anywhere where we can leverage technology and augment human capacity to do automations of simple things like calculations. And the overall goal is still the same: increase efficiency, reduce costs, improve quality, reduce errors. But we're saying, yeah, let's do that for life science manufacturers with the people. So there's an emphasis on the word augmenting humans. So Dan, can you share with the audience some of what we've seen with automation and these specific automation types?
Yeah, certainly. So, like Brian mentioned earlier, these aren't the sexy automations where there's a robot involved, but they're sexy in their own way. And when we first started to do the ROA analysis, I would refer to them as automations, and sometimes they would confuse the people that we were talking to, the target audience, because they were thinking about a traditional robot type or removing the operator from the process, whereas I'm looking at removing the operator from the data transcription or data capture. So date, time, and signature seems like a simple thing, but in a good sized record, there could be thousands of those. And while there is a time component to not having to do that, to me, the more impactful thing is on the release side, where how many times have your batch release personnel stopped what they're doing, which is reviewing and releasing your batch, to get up and go chase down somebody for a missing signature, an incorrect date, et cetera. Calculations are one of those sneaky things that adds up. In a paper-based system, I'm going to do a calculation. I'm probably going to hand that to somebody to verify it. It's probably going to get verified again before it goes to batch release, and then batch release is going to verify that calculation again. So that every calculation gets done at least 3 or 4 times. There's a time component to that. And it's also not foolproof. I'm sure if you go back through your CAPA history over the last couple of years, there's been a batch somewhere that had an incorrect calculation get through, and you've had to make a product quality decision on it. An interesting side note, when you look at the builder tool in MasterControl, the calculation itself is actually one of the only step types that is not able to assign a verifier to it. We work on the premise of you construct the master template, you validate the calculation, and you never check it again. Table aggregates, again, it's just more math, that calculation type of thing where we're doing it iterative throughout a run. Again, that's just another calculation that has to be verified. Data projections is super useful automation, and typically in a paper record, you might be on page 75 and there's an interesting value that the operator needs to retrieve from page 3. They stop what they're doing, they start flipping through the batch record. Hopefully the batch record's in order so they can quickly get to page 3. The data projection takes all that out of the equation. If interesting value on page 3 needs to be seen on page 75, it's projected onto page 75 and the operator doesn't have to do any manipulation. Conditional paths, probably one of our top 3 features that's used. That's automated. So if I look at a paper record and you'll come to some instruction or some test value, and then it says, if it's greater than X, line out in NA the next 5 sections. And if it's Y, then do those 5 sections, but NA and skip the 2 sections on page 48. All that's done automatically through the system. We set those paths up as part of configuration, and when that operator provides the answer, the system will automatically NA the correct steps and present the operator the path to go. So you're taking that operator error out of the equation. Time and date calculations. I'm sure a lot of you have very time critical processes where something must go into an oven for a certain amount of time, plus or minus. Or I'm going to do a mixing operation and it has to mix for a minimum of 30 minutes, et cetera. So now you're relying on the operator to record a start time, record a stop time, remember to go back at the right time, and then have to manually configure those. And especially when you go over 24 hours, nobody likes having to do those types of calculations, again, automated in the system. Barcodes. I have a different presentation where I have a picture of a barcode scanner and say, this should be your new best friend. So many times we'll encounter a customer and say, hey, what's your biggest error rate? And it's like, oh, we have to check part numbers and lot numbers because operators are doing typos and transcription errors. MasterControl supports barcode scanning right out of the box with no configuration. So every time I'm on a manufacturing floor, you'll see thousands of barcodes. Everything is barcoded. Components, bags of components are labeled with barcodes. Raw materials are labeled with barcodes. Product moving through the system is labeled with barcodes. And you look and I don't see a barcode scanner anywhere. And that's possibly an artifact of paper because you really can't scan into paper. Now we're going to go digital. Scan those barcodes. 1, it's faster. 2, it's error proof. And the same thing with limits. Even if an operator is aware that they have a limit, they're going to take a measurement and they're going to record the value. They still have to make a manual type decision. Hey, is this in spec or out of spec? That is completely automated. The system will tell you when you're out of spec and prompt you to take additional actions or the correct action for that scenario. So not automation in the truest sense, but automation that's really helpful for error proofing and to speed your release times.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. And then if we switch over to what most people view automation as being, it's integrating with equipment, such as scales and balances, but it could be anything, a blender, et cetera. And then integrating with other enterprise information systems like an ERP. What's really important to note is that the former page of the native automations, there's no integration project. That's just what comes out of the box, if you will. These types of integrations that we're showing, we also have some out of the box capability, but it's important to note whenever you integrate with an ERP, there's still some data mapping to map what your batch record fields are, how they're mapped to your specific fields that are coming from your work orders and whatnot in your ERP. And there's still some integration that's required to whether you're going after a Mettler Toledo or a different type of vendor. So these turn into a little bit more of a development project or an integration project. And that'll be important when we talk about, we can do all of these integrations, but which ones give us the biggest bang for the buck? Which ones are the fastest ones to perform, and which ones happen to occur in batch records most often? That's where we're going to go next. So when we look at the impact on operations, or what we like to talk about as bang for the buck, here is the fascinating discovery, some of the secret sauce that I would say. when we look at batch records, we started doing an analysis on those, and we call it a return on automation analysis. We wanted to categorize and count how many manual entries in the batch record could be automated or eliminated with the native automations, the ones that Dan spoke about, and how many could be automated or eliminated with the more traditional system integrations to equipment and scales and balances. The shocking, surprising discovery was more than half, 54% on average, more than half of the batch records manual entries go away just by digitizing. Those are things like calculations and time and date stamps and aggregates and the projections. An incremental 27% that takes 54 to 81 can be eliminated when you integrate things like barcode scanning or equipment integrations or ERPs or other enterprise information systems like I showed on the prior slide. But it's important to note 54% goes away natively, and then barcode scanning will give you another 9%, and then integration with an ERP will give you another 8%, and then integration with equipment will give you another 5%. What I'm highlighting here is the 27% incremental is actually segmented into multiple different systems. So the biggest bang for the buck by far is just digitizing, and then you get into smaller amounts. And it's important to note every batch record is different. And so what I'm presenting here is just the averages. And what you should do is analyze your own batch record or work with us and we'll analyze it, actually counting how many things, how many manual entries would be automated by the various types of automations, and not just blindly say, well, the first integration we want to do, or the first automation we want to do is X, Y, and Z. So that is the precursor to one of the questions that we get, which is we tout that we can significantly reduce lead time by significantly reducing release time. And our claim is and measured by actual, it's not just an empty claim, it's measured and proven by actual customers. Release times will be reduced by 90% or more with review by exception. And the missing element when we say that, most of our customers and prospects that we're working with, there's a level of disbelief, partly because they've asked their QA groups, I need you to shift from 21 days and take 2 days off of that. Can you do that? I don't think we can do that. We've tried. We've thrown our most brilliant minds at it, and we can't get more than 2 days off of 21. We're still at 19, as an example. And then a software vendor is coming in and saying, yeah, we could take that down by 90%. So how is the point of this presentation? Part of it is the review by exception that I'll touch on. The other part is what we just went through with the return on automation. If you start with 1,000 manual data entries for simple math, and you eliminate or automate on average 81%, you only have 190 entries remaining. So think about those manual entries in your paper-based batch record as being this friction that exists and slows down your entire production process, particularly your review and release process. So if you have 1,000 manual entries, they have to be 1,000 manual entries that are reviewed page by page, line by line, and by the QA group and the manufacturing group. If you only have 190 because you've eliminated or automated 810 of those, then your review and release only has to review 190. And your manufacturing group, if this is still required, and sometimes it just goes away, only has to review 190. And what we're seeing, if you start out with a 21-day average, this was originally 7 days, this should go down from 7 to 3 to 0 as you incrementally improve. And this review and release process was originally 14 days. It should go from 14 to 9 to hours. And the reason it goes to that last step is we're deploying review by exception. In the paper-based process, you have to review, everybody does, but they don't really realize it. They have to review the 99% of the things that went right. in the review by exception process, not only have we eliminated the number greatly reduced the number of manual data entries, we've improved the quality of the ones that are remaining based on limits and checking. But we also have this capability to allow companies to only look at the things that went wrong. Don't look at all the things that went right. And through those combined mechanisms, that's how we're able to reduce the release time by 90%. And the real business goal is you reduce the release time, you shift that from right to left. Now your executives are really interested because we can, however you measure lead time, if lead time is measured by the beginning of manufacturing to when we actually ship it to customers, we can reduce that significantly. And in this example, we're saying from 21 days to 12 days. But if we're going to get to 90%, 21 days is actually going to get down to closer to 1 or 2 days. So in this digital transformation, we've learned about how we can impact the return on automation, how we impact the number of manual entries, etc. But there's also a little bit of secret sauce as you shift from paper to digital that Dan's going to talk about next.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. So shifting to a digital first mindset, it's a topic that I like to just call thinking digitally. And I could probably do an entire webinar on that, and maybe someday we will. But today I'll just try to boil it down to its most important parts. So many customers, when we get into an engagement, they're making their first, I'm going to do air quote, digital transformation. And they arrive with their paper batch record and they've decided they want to replicate it. We'll call that paper on glass. And you'll notice here that I very purposefully lined through paper on glass. And when customers that configure paper on glass, there's a temptation. They have something that works, and I'll say they think it works, like they're comfortable with it. They just want to recreate it. They don't want to have to think about it. But it generally doesn't work out. The customers that I see who have configured paper on glass, very typically within 6 to 9 months after go live, they're coming back to MasterControl and they're asking us for help. They're not seeing the return on investment they were expecting. Oftentimes the operators are not having a good user experience. Basically, if it wasn't efficient before, it's just going to be digitally inefficient afterwards. So we need to get to the digital thinking process. And how do we do that? And I think one of the easiest ways and most important ways I like to call rethink the why. Before you start the digital transformation, you want to look at your paper record and look at each data capture, each verifier, each witness, and ask why. What is the purpose of that data point? Is it for compliance? Is it for quality? Is it for operational tracking? Does it have some other purpose? Is the data even still relevant, right? Manufacturing processes evolve. Some historical data requirement that I may have had originally when I put this into manufacturing or into production, that may no longer be necessary. Most importantly, can the data be captured automatically? And that's where the digital thinking really elevates. The more you can get into those automations, the better. You know, Brian talked about, I think briefly I had mentioned like a scale integration on his integration slide. And I think of something simple, like I put something on a scale and weigh it. And in a paper environment, I'm going to put it on the scale and I'm going to weigh it. And then I'm going to have somebody come and verify that that data transcription was correct. And then if I have a printer hooked up to my scale, I'm going to print out a little ribbon tape, and then I'm going to tape that into the batch record. And I've taken something that's a very simple thing, and I've turned it into a 2-person job, and now it's got 4 steps, right? From an automation perspective, I put something on a scale. I just want to hit a capture data button, and I want that scale data to come directly from the scale into my batch record. So I've taken a 1-step process, and I've truly made it a 1-step data capture. And then when I do pull the data directly from a device, I eliminate the need for that second operator. So I don't have to involve that second person. So automations are super important. Was this data capture because of an audit observation or a CAPA? You want to make sure you don't lose that. I mean, a lot of audit observations in CAPAs or corrective actions they're in place because of a paper system, or they're there because of the limits of the paper system. Or even the underlying error was caused by deficiencies in the paper system. So you don't want to have to recreate those digitally. You just want to be able to look at that with fresh set of eyes. And then always ask yourself who uses the data and for what purpose. And understanding who consumes the data will help you understand whether it's got true value to continue capturing that in the record. In a one-on-one, I usually get a little more provocative with this, and I'll say, hey, how many times has an auditor wrecked a perfectly good process? But we'll keep it defined to audit at this point. You know, it's not really the auditor's fault. The auditor is rightfully bringing up some deficiency that they found. And it really just comes down sometimes to how we respond to those audit observations. And I'll say this in full transparency. I spent 26 years in the industry before I came to MasterControl, and I've done the same thing myself. We all have day jobs. I don't even have time to deal with the audit, but I have the audit. It's just going to add stress. And then I get the audit report. Now I have a very short time frame to get that response. Back when I was in industry, it was typically 30 days if it was an internal audit or a corporate audit. And my choices are, well, I can take my best engineers off their day jobs and put them on super valuable root cause investigations, or like that first line item there, I could just go, I'll just have somebody verify it. And that's great for the first audit. But when you're talking about a mature process, your paper record contains the warts of all the years or decades of audit responses. And those less than deep dive corrective actions will catch up to you. So again, it's very helpful when we go to digital thinking mode to try to re-examine all of those. Another place I see this is in high volume customers or automated, semi-automated manufacturing customers. They're all doing hourly checks. And I always get a chuckle when I see an hourly check, because it would be nice to think that every single manufacturer on the planet has the exact same process variability, and it always happens to be 60 minutes because most of them are doing checks every 60 minutes. But the reality is they're probably just doing those checks every hour so that when they find an issue, they can limit how far back they have to go in time to do some bounding or check some additional parts. But then whenever I see a record that has the hourly check with tolerances, I know there's an audit observation behind that. Because, again, on a paper record, if I do my 12 o'clock check and then I come to do my 1 o'clock check and it's 1:07, I'm probably going to write down 1 o'clock because it's my 1 o'clock check, right? And everybody who's worked in manufacturing knows I just described pencil whipping, and it's a thing. But one day somebody wrote down 65 minutes and the auditor saw it. And the next week they're going to put in a corrective action that says an hour plus or minus 10 minutes. Right? They're going to give themselves a buffer. And so with the digital thinking, when I'm looking at those type of records, say, hey, what do they do when they do it at 71 minutes? And they'll say, well, we do a nonconformance. And it's like, well, how do you disposition the nonconformance? And they say, well, we disposition it as no impact because we're really just trying to limit the bounding. Like, wow, that was the original reason you put it in there. Took a less than optimal corrective action just because it was easy. I should embed those things in my SOPs and get rid of that plus or minus on that check. Label reconciliation is not really from an audit. The last two aren't really from audits. I should put those on a different slide in the future. But label reconciliation, just from a digital thinking perspective, in a paper record, somebody is going to issue labels, and then someone's going to consume labels, and then someone's going to return labels to stock, et cetera. And those things happen throughout the record, but they're typically put on a single page. So the operator has to leave where they're working in the record and then go find the label reconciliation page to do that. Well, in a digital environment, those things can be recorded at point of use. So I don't have to have a special label reconciliation page. You just have to have a calculation somewhere in the record that's going to do that accountability and that reconciliation. Same thing with safety sections. See, section 1 is going to be the bomb because if there's an investigation, I want to go to one place to look for all my materials. Second section is the safety section because, well, any operator that's going to get this record is going to have to flip through it to get to where they're working. And that safety section on a digital record, as soon as somebody completes, the first person completes the safety section, then that is going to show as closed and no one else is going to go back and look in that record. So the digital thinking says, I'm going to embed the safety not in its own section. I'm going to embed those warnings specifically at point of use so that an individual operator engaging there knows exactly where I need him to, or what he needs to see from a safety perspective. Last thing would be properly assessing risk. So if you work in life sciences, you're familiar with these numbers, confidence intervals and reliability for validation, right? We validate our processes to 95/95 or 95/99, or for terminal sterilization, 95/99.9. And we're going to do that based on the FMEA. You know, where does this particular risk fall from an FMEA perspective? Yet at the same time, we expect how we capture the data to be 100% perfect every time. So I like to say from a digital thinking perspective, we would want to approach that record with an FMEA mindset. Where is the risk for these data captures? And do I have other systems to collect that data? And my favorite example, and it's a little bit contentious with some of the QA folks I interact with, so don't get focused on the example, but get focused on the process. But my favorite one, because it is a little provocative, is to talk about lot numbers. People spend an awful lot of time checking lot numbers. Batch release people checking lot numbers. I record a lot number, I verify it. Ultimately, that lot number is controlled by your ERP system. And you've got, so to start with, you have a backup system that's collecting that data. Either the ERP allocated that lot number to the batch, or you're recording it and backflushing it in the ERP. So you've got two opportunities there to verify that record without having a second person to do it or batch release to do it. And then when risk is high and backups are limited, that's the ultimate case for automation. And again, let's think about doing that for the lot numbers, right? If I can't rely on the backup system, or I don't want to rely on the backup system, then we need to automate that. We need to barcode scan it. We need to do automated checks. So if I'm consuming something later in the record that I've allocated early in the record, we can scan it, and then we can say, yes, it's the right one from earlier in the record, and build those automations in to keep the people from having to do the checking on the back end. With that, I'll turn it back over to Brian.
Great. Thanks, Dan. So here's the portion of the presentation that we're going to share some actual customer outcomes, and otherwise known as real world results. So this is an example of a CDMO working on a biologics product, and it's complicated, but I'll simplify. It's a control chart showing that their mean average number of times to review and release was at 118 in the paper batch record. Arguably, they implemented MX and then did some of the paper on glass mistakes that Dan highlighted. So they did see improvements. It went from, I think, 120 days to close to 80 days, but 80 days is still too long. And so Dan and other consultants helped, and then the customer looked at how do they actually improve and think digitally. And as a result, this chart shows that they got down to 18 days. So they had a continuous improvement effort. And the other interesting part is since then, they're actually reduced down to 2 days was the most recent. And Dan, usually when I say 2 days, I was just going
to say they're very excited about their 2 days, and every time I interact with them and they bring up the 2 days, I'm like, awesome, that's still a day and a half too long.
Yes. So as that earlier slide, thanks, Dan, as that earlier slide mentioned, reviewing by exception should get down to hours, minutes, depending on your process. And so just summarizing, they went from more than 120 days down to 2 days, and we're still working with them to reduce it beyond 2. But imagine what this does for the lead time. Imagine what that does for the overall business and their overall throughput. Here's another customer that has been using our system, MX, Manufacturing Excellence Production Records, for several years. And if you think about the paper-based batch record, what do the QA groups find in final review and release? GDP errors. So predominantly, if not near 100% of those problems found are GDP errors. So we've got our haystack, if you will. Everybody's focused on the haystack, and the real product quality errors are hidden somewhere in that haystack. But we've got to wade through all of the GDP problems. So one of the things and the way we express value with customers is track how many digital entries are made. And then we apply human error studies. Down here, you can see a 3% error rate. This particular customer over the lifetime has captured 47 million data captures. Multiplying 3% times 4%, 47 million comes out to 1.4 million errors that going digital helped avoid. If they had stayed on paper, that many errors would have been generated from a GDP perspective. And not all of them turn into a CAPAs, but some of them do. But all of them need to be investigated.
Hey, Brian,
Dan,
just to point out real quick.
Else?
Yeah, I did. So you said they had 47 million lifetime data captures. If you think back to your earlier slide on ROA, the fact that they digitized eliminated 54% on average. So 47 million data captures is a lot. And to me, that's awesome to think about from a reporting and data analytics perspective. But it also replaced close to 100, the real number would have been up closer to 100 million if they hadn't digitized. The scale just blows my mind sometimes.
Yep. Great addition. Thank you. Yes, it's if they'd still been on paper, they would have had more than 47 million, arguably close to twice as many. So decreasing those errors reduces the friction in the entire process. You get shorter review times, you get better audit outcomes, and you reduce your overall risk. And you don't have teams of people going line by line, page by page, just to make sure that the 99% of the things that went right actually did go right. Here's a different customer looked at before and after. And if you're looking at going digital, one of the things I would recommend is baselining. Baselining some of your, because everybody wants to kind of brush it under the rug, if you will. Where are you spending time now? How many errors are you actually getting and managing and seeing in a paper-based, so that when you do go digital, you can have some before and after. In this case, this particular customer had lots of operators, close to 100, that were spending 5 hours per week entering data on the paper-based batch record. They predicted that they could cut that in half. Then they measured it, and in fact, they did cut it in half. So 50% of their time that was spent on paper was reduced. So that's 2.5 hours per operator per week. And those numbers add up. They thought the manufacturing review that was almost 2 hours would go to 0. As it turns out, they still, when they digitized, they had some parts of their process that were still coming in and were paper. So they did not at this point go to 0, but 1.75 to 1 is still a 43% reduction in manufacturing review hours. QA review hours, they thought would reduce by 75% from 4 to 1, and it did. But the interesting note on this one, this is before they applied holistically the review by exception process. So just reducing the number of manual entries is what gave them the 75% improvement. And after this slide had been created, I know that this number has increased. The reduction has been improved further because they have implemented review by exception. But it's a great one to highlight the actual number of people needed to do this. From a non-value added time perspective, you're either saving non-value added time, or you're able to do a lot more with the same number of people, or you don't need as many people performing these tasks that can be looking for, not looking at the haystack, instead looking at and addressing product quality issues. This is a little bit of an eye chart. Let me summarize by saying this kind of ties together some of the ROA concepts. We can count when we're trying to assess value for any given customer, how many calculations, how many table calculations, how many time and date calculations. We can count how many times that happens. And then we can estimate the amount of time saved each time it happens. And that generates the total minutes saved. And for this customer, who also had the 1.4 million errors, over 15 million minutes have been saved, and 252,000 non-value-added hours have been eliminated. And that adds up to a lot of people. But it's not necessarily that we're displacing the people or replacing, it's non-value-added hours eliminated. So ideally, as Dan said earlier, you hired operators to operate, you hired operators to perform a task. Instead of doing these manual tasks in a non-automated fashion, they can actually hopefully produce more for you. And then one last chart, I believe. This is the holy grail, I would like to call it, because this is what helps organizations, in particular executives, justify the investment in going digital. All the other ones are micro optimizations, if you will. It helps the QA group or it helps the manufacturing group. This helps an overall organization. And speaking of the baseline, one of our customers did a before and after analysis. And the only difference between the blue line in 2022 and the green line in 2024, as well as the pink line here, they garnered a 31% year-over-year improvement. Same factory, same product, same operators. They were just able to do that much more. And what's really interesting to note on this one is prior to going digital, they thought they were at 100% capacity of this building. And so if they're going to produce more, they were going to have to spin up a whole nother building, team, everything, all the infrastructure that goes with it. So for this group particularly, a 31% year-over-year improvement came with not having to do the expense of spinning up a whole nother site. Tremendous results. So with that, hopefully you've learned and we've been able to share some observations. Let's kick it over to Q&A.
Okay, so Brian, we've got some questions coming in via chat. So first question, how long does it take to see these results?
Oh, great question. And one we probably, I don't know if we've ever talked for 45 minutes and not mentioned 120 days. 120 days is what we target for our customers to go live with their first batch record in production mode. And 120 days, that was a key design element and requirement, because what we saw in the industry is customers representing at conferences and in webinars how they were so excited to go live with a traditional MES in 18 to 24 months. 18 to 24 months is not agile enough, it's not quick enough, and it's one of the reasons that leads to why life science manufacturers, upwards of 80%, are still using paper. The investment just isn't worth it if it's going to take 2 years to see if this EBR thing works. Whereas in 120 days, it's just, it's September, so for customers just starting, some of them could actually have their first production record before the end of 2025. If not, then really, really early in 2026. If you go with a configurable solution versus one that historically has to be programmed. So 120 days is the target and the one that we work with our customers to make sure it happens.
Awesome, thanks. We have another question. How does one go about doing the ROA analysis?
Fun question. They don't talk to me, they talk to Dan. And I'll give you the secret there. On one hand, there's an element of all you really need to do is go to your batch record and count how many calculations are there and how many certain other operations are there. I could do that. The thing I can't do is I don't have the knowledge that Dan has, because he's helped customers, over 100 customers with over 500 batch records, go from paper to digital. So when he looks at a paper record, he sees it differently than I do. And he knows what will map from paper to digital. So how do you go about it? Contact us. It's one of the things that we do during the sales process, because we want to give you the ammunition to go to your own organization and say, if we just go digital in 120 days, more than half of the batch record will be eliminated. All the manual entries will be eliminated. So it's really helpful when doing the assessment to know not only how many will be eliminated, how many manual entries will be eliminated just natively, but then the next step will be, do barcodes or integrations with the ERP or integrations to the equipment? Which one should I do first? And the ROA analysis will tell you that.
Yeah, super important point, because I think, Brian, you would agree with this, that everybody, when they come into this, if they are thinking about integrations, they all want to do the ERP integration because that's the big sexy integration. And oftentimes when we'll do the ROA, there might be a 5% lift by doing the ERP integration and a 30% or a 20% lift by doing the analytical equipment integration. So if it helps us prioritize what things are really could be phase 1 versus phase 2 and beyond.
Absolutely.
Third question: do you see similar or different results by industry?
Ooh, that's a good question, particularly if you think about the charts that we showed. The one chart showed the customer had 120 plus day batch record review and release process. And if I were in the pharma industry and I were a cell and gene company, I'd be saying 120 days. How do you do that? I'm an autologous delivery and I have 72 hours to do my entire process. So what's relevant here is by going digital, from paper to digital, we can reduce the release times by 90%. I just spoke to a customer last week. They reduced it by 97, but they went from 2 hours to 3 minutes, whereas the slide I showed was 120 days to 2 days. So depending on your part of the industry, definitely there are differences in what your release time will be and what's acceptable in a paper base. That also depends on your volumes, etc. So there's definitely differences, but strikingly or surprisingly, almost every entity we've worked with has been able to reduce the review time by 90%, regardless of how many days they've been starting with.
Great points. Next question: what's been the biggest surprise?
Two come to my mind. The biggest surprise, so I started my career in the 90s, displacing paper with IBM. And the biggest surprise to me probably happened 9 to 10 years ago when we started looking at the MES market and life science manufacturers and realized almost everybody's on paper. Yes, there are companies that have implemented their highest volume lines on an MES, but upwards of 80% are on paper. And it's a surprise and scary. And personally, the kind of passion that's unacceptable, it's irresponsible in my opinion, because once you know all the errors that happen and go along with paper, we as an industry should not be willing to accept so many of our life science manufacturers still using paper. The second surprise is smaller, and it's what we talked about today, which was, the ERP integration might have 5 fields in your batch record, and it's low on the totem pole in terms of priority. Understanding the mechanics of what's going on inside the batch record reveals information that we shared today and want to share more broadly about going digital is the best first step you can take. Integrations is a great second step.
Yeah, I always think that's a fun part of an ROA when you get to deliver it for the first time, and you'll say, well, you have 7,200 data entries, and people, their mouths said, we have 7,000 data entries in that? Like, they have no idea the scale of what they're actually doing inside what's to them just an innocuous record. Last
Totally
question,
agree.
Brian, what are you looking forward to next?
I'm looking forward to not saying 80% of life science manufacturers. I'm looking forward to dropping to 70, 60, 50. One day, maybe we'll be able to say that the majority of life science manufacturers are actually digital. That's in the macro sense. I would say, Dan and you and I just chatted earlier this afternoon on we have AI. Lots of places where we can leverage other technology and AI that we can definitely use on that.
Awesome. I think that wraps up the questions that we have.
Okay, very good. Well, I'm going to just hop back on and thank you both. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge with us today. And thank you to the audience for watching. We will see you next time. Have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.